Knights of the Old Republic 1 is a powerhouse of game design. It put future Western RPG darlings BioWare on the map, it created a mainstream PC RPG on a home console, carving the way for some of my favorite games ever. Hell, it gave the original Xbox one of its first exclusive RPGs. It took Star Wars in a bold new direction, and perhaps for the first time proved that it wasn't necessarily dependent on that little sliver of 40 or so years between The Phantom Menace, Return of the Jedi, and all of the stuff the books were doing after the fact. It told a personal and meaningful story that fits into the Star Wars mythos without losing the gravitas that comes with it. It has its quirks for sure, but I really enjoy it and feel like it holds up pretty damn well for being, 15 years old? I mean, you already know that if you watched our Kotor 1 review, which you should definitely go watch. Pretty please? Just so we're on the same page, I started this review maybe 6 months after that one. That's right, I've been working on this review since 2017, and I'm gonna blow your mind with all my hot takes and in-depth commentary about the Force, the entire Star Wars universe, and this game, Knights of the Old Republic 2, just you wait. Star Wars is pretty damn cool. Okay, we're off to a good start. Star Wars is cool because it means a lot of things to a lot of people. And while people on the internet will tell you that it's all George's vision one way or another, the number of creators, in particular fans, who have influenced and created and shaped this universe into what it is today is innumerable. Star Wars is about people, the people who make it, but also the people who love it. When BioWare turned down the opportunity to develop the sequel to Knights of the Old Republic, LucasArts enlisted Obsidian Entertainment, who was built from the defunct Black Isle studio, who had worked with BioWare back in their Interplay days. They kind of got RPGs. I mean, Obsidian would go on to develop my favorite game ever, Fallout New Vegas. On top of that, Fallout 2 writer and all-around cool guy Chris Avellone got tapped as lead designer and writer. Psst, he'd go on to work on New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, and another top fiver for me, Prey 2017. I'm trying to convey that, even though this was their first published game, Obsidian had some serious pedigree behind it. Okay, back to how Star Wars is cool. Because of the massive amounts of stories that can and should be told within the Star Wars universe, there's an opportunity for a little bit of meta. By having such a hard line between good and evil and inhabiting its world with characters who have depth and opinions and differing worldviews, Star Wars can ask questions and critique itself in universe. Sometimes long-standing series need to ask themselves why they still exist, how the world has changed since they were created, and should they still exist. Logan, Skyfall, The Winter Soldier, and even The Last Jedi come to mind with varying degrees of success. The first time I remember a piece of Star Wars media doing this was in those old Boba Fett YA novels that took place in the Clone Wars, where Boba went to the Jedi Temple and realized they were a bunch of boring, arrogant, sexless dickheads who killed his dad for basically no reason. Star Wars can have these, again, weird, boring, arrogant, sexless space wizards fighting for a questionable moral right and then say, you know, that questionable moral right they're fighting for is questionable, and here's why. And while inherently what they're doing equates to a net positive to the galaxy, there's a potential here to do more damage than good. An assumption that the people who disagree with you are largely unjustified and just psychotic is a little naive, and by creating an ultimate supremacy in your viewpoint, there's a potential for even more dangerous detractors to arise, like Darth Sidious and the alt-right. Chris Avellone was critical of the way the Force and Star Wars in general had poised these two religions at each other's throats, and dictated who wins and who loses, and who's right and who's wrong when things aren't that simple. Before The Last Jedi, Kotor 2 feels like the largest scale critique of how the Star Wars universe works, and as a result people, mostly internet goons, pair up the two, saying how one exemplifies criticism of the Star Wars franchise while still respecting the main tenets of the universe, and the other pisses all over my childhood, boo-hoo-hoo, I smell like poo. Kotor 2 asks for much of its story, hey, is this a good way to run a galaxy? Is this a good way to handle, belief? And tries to see what you think, and starts a conversation with you. I know that seems like a bad thing for a Star Wars game, but it's done pretty effectively. There are extremely long and often boring video essays about how this game connects to moral relativism, nihilism, existentialism, and a whole bunch of other things you learn in a Philosophy 101 class, and if that's what you're looking for here, you might be a little bit disappointed. You're not gonna get philosophy, but you'll at least get a breakdown of story and the design that makes this game so great. There's a lot to unpack with this one, in a good way, and Avellone in particular put a lot into it. So much so that even in 2019, he's commenting on it on Twitter. Sorry it's taking me so long to get to the actual review side that we all, myself included, came here for, but Kotor 2 is basically mired in all the behind the scenes, gutsy stuff, and its high concept interpretation of the Star Wars universe. And I wanted to rip whatever band-aids I had off early because if not, it'll get wrinkled and gross and fall off when I jump in the pool. So here it is, Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords. Taking place 5 years after the events of the first one in the aftermath of a particularly devastating Jedi Civil War that took place after the war with the Mandalorians, the Jedi Order is once again on the verge of extinction. You, a Jedi exile and coincidentally one of the only not dead Jedi, find yourself hunted by the Sith and forced to restore the Jedi Order to save the Republic. This mostly involves you traveling to a variety of planets, getting involved in local gossip, and hoping that maybe you'll stumble across one of the 4 boring-ass white humans that are the Last Jedi Council. Okay, I guess they aren't all boring, this one has a cool mustache. This is a gross oversimplification for sure, and one that directly conflicts with some of the more later game stuff, but as far as a simple, spoiler-free synopsis, this'll have to do. Following a similar formula as the first game, where certain planets can be played in whatever order, the player gets involved with the world's minor conflict that connects to the overarching plot and then the potential fall of the Republic. Most start small, helping out Ithorians with restoration projects or keeping a crime syndicate from harassing local businesses, and then end with a conflict that changes the power structure of the planet, which is an excellent way to create tension in your levels, while ensuring that low-level players aren't overwhelmed no matter what planet they end up at first. And while that's a super cool way to respect player choice, it definitely makes this feel like a lot slower of an experience. Once Kotor 1 got moving, it really moved. But Kotor 2 isn't afraid to let you breathe and walk across the map a couple of times, or let someone walk into the room during a cutscene. While there are moments where the plot is really moving, it's not afraid to really slow things down, sometimes to a fault. See, Kotor 2 likes to drip feed the player information, especially in the first 10 or so hours. And I gotta say, it's one of my favorite tricks that Star Wars does. About every film throws you right in the middle of the action and lets you figure out what the hell is actually going on until a bigger expository moment that helps fill in the gaps and make sure everyone's on the same page. In A New Hope, it's here. And in Kotor 2, it happens when you meet Atris, a dialogue tree that feels almost like a boss battle. Like the first game, this one absolutely shines in its conversations, and the first encounter with Atris was the moment I realized how different of an experience from Kotor 1 this was going to be. You're intended to be against Atris, 2 unlikely people brought together by the will of the Force, and unfortunately you have to actually talk to each other and try and make sure you both have the same information. And while you're opposed to Atris in some way, the thoughts and feelings you can express never feel like it isn't your voice. There's a lot of opinions you can have on the Mandalorian Wars and why you were exiled from the Jedi Order. It's a wonderful moment that blends a truly dynamic role-playing experience with that token Avalon moral relativism. It feels like a precursor to your interactions with Caesar in New Vegas, who talks to you about how he sees the in-game universe. He has a conversation with you, and with finely tuned dialogue trees allows you to realize while his actions are Machiavellian and archaic, his intentions aren't necessarily evil. Caesar is educated, probably more so than the entire NCR and his legionaries combined, and he saw a world that was in dire need of order. And Atris, along with the rest of the council, saw a faction that could have been defeated, but was worried at what cost. Star Wars is bursting with anti-war sentiments.
Great warrior! Wars not make one great!
No longer certain that one ever does win a war. I am.
Try to fight, and you will fail. The rebellion will be destroyed.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
Have you ever considered that we may be on the wrong side?
Till now you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love.
And while action was definitely necessary, as the Mandalorians could have eaten the galaxy whole, it's understandable that Atris didn't want to get involved, and her decision would in turn eat her whole. And with its great conversations comes great characters. Typically my litmus test for RPGs is if there's one party member I'm willing to run away with. In Fallout 4, it was Piper. In New Vegas, it was Cass. And in Kotor 1, it was Bastila. This time, it's Atton. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Anakin in the Clone Wars, charming and a bit hot-headed, but competent and conflicted in very strange ways. He may be misguided, but his heart's in the right place. And honestly, if he showed up on my doorstep with a box of chocolates and plane tickets to Aruba, I wouldn't hesitate. And I think that's a big plus for KOTOR 2. Nihilists aside, every character has a reason to be connected to you, to be along on this journey and have their own thoughts and feelings about the galaxy as a whole. Even the more minor characters have weird quirks that make them feel like they're alive. There's a Rodian on Dantooine who is very adamant that you need to be armed to survive here. It's an incredibly minor interaction, and it would have been so easy to just leave that out, but it makes the world feel immersive. I know that's a really tired thing to say, but it is. Also, I don't really dislike a companion. While none of them reach the levels of characters like Bastila, none are as boring as Juhani or as much of a nuisance as Mission, who Dakota loves in Galaxy of Heroes, apparently? I don't know. Bao-Dur is deadpan comedic. Mandalore has the reverence for battle that reminds me of Klingons, and the Handmaiden feels representative of the player's inner conflict. Like with a lot of RPGs like this, I feel there's an opportunity for some of the characters to fall through the cracks. I disliked the way events played out on Nar Shaddaa so much that I left Mira on the ship and never really unlocked her higher influence benefits. I almost exclusively brought along Kreia and either Atten, Handmaiden, or HK that I felt little attachment to Visas and her arc in the late game. I passed all of her speech checks, but she never really blossomed into a higher tier character like I feel like the game wanted. I did, however, really enjoy going back to the Ebon Hawk after every mission and checking up on everybody. And unlike most RPGs, Kotor 2 wasn't afraid to let some of your party members have their own adventures. And while I personally find these to be my least favorite parts, it prevents them from feeling like a handful of animatronics that only move when you walk by them, which isn't necessarily something I could say about the level design. Nar Shaddaa in particular ended up being a bit of a mess for me, as a series of plot forwarding cutscenes would only trigger after you had to arbitrarily gain the attention of a criminal organization. And in order to do so, you were required to backtrack and wander through a terribly laid out refugee section, which led to more headaches than necessary. The whole game feels a little looser in the way it designs its levels, which is a nice way of saying I found them more tiresome than the first game. Again, Nar Shaddaa had these cutscenes conveniently placed far enough apart that it made me feel like I was trapped in a game-breaking bug. I wasn't. I mean, that wouldn't happen until later, but it was just enough to make me have my doubts. There's tons to do, which was great, but it felt padded by backtracking. There's no return to the Ebon Hawk option, making levels feel bigger than they have to, and if you move from Paragus to Talos to Nar Shaddaa, well, I hope you like cold gray hallways. It's a little slow to start, and I can't help but feel like a lot of the more tutorial stuff that happened on Talos could have and did happen on Paragus. It's kind of weird how long this game takes to get moving, especially compared to modern Western RPGs, and the late game feels shorter than the first game too. Taurus was long for sure, but the progression was mostly linear, and the stuff on the Endar Spire was much shorter than Paragus. I know it isn't necessarily fair to compare the structure of these two games, as they're very different stories and developed very close together by two different teams, but they're similar enough for comparisons to be made. I really like how this era of Star Wars looks though, not just in KOTOR, but also that sort of prequel-y feel. I know, that's blasphemy, but when I was on board a Hammerhead Corvette, I realized how dynamic and interesting everything looks. I don't know if Doug Chiang did this specifically, I kinda doubt it, but it feels like an expansion of his work. Things like the Republic soldiers and Sith troopers fit into what I think of when I think of Star Wars. I feel like that's a challenge with the franchise. It's so easy to look at something and go, that isn't very Star Wars, but you really can't explain why. The Droids cartoons are a big example of this for me, but a huge thing that makes these games so important to the franchise is that they're separated from the main saga but still feel like they belong. This isn't exclusive to KOTOR 2 by any means, and if anything applies more to the first game than this one. Duxun and Onderon notwithstanding, I feel that a lot of the levels are repeats or again in cold dark hallways, which is kind of a shame. I know that this game had some seriously comically short development time, but it's definitely something worth pointing out. Also, I know that repeats would usually be a bad thing, but seeing Dantooine and Korriban, these two worlds that are so important to the Jedi and Sith, just torn down as a result of this conflict was so poignant. By having such a short development time, these are obviously here to lessen the load a little bit, but they end up being honestly some of the best. Korriban is home to your character's own version of the tree on Dagobah, where you see the ghosts of your past decisions and the people who died because they followed you into war. By placing itself in the aftermath of the previous title and expanding the mythos and adopting a darker tone really makes this feel more Empire than Hope, which is excellent. No longer is it focusing on establishing this world, and instead is choosing to tell a story, expanding how things like the Force works and how these characters interact with each other. And again, while I'm not super into Talos and Nar Shaddaa, I don't actively dislike any of the ones we get, except for maybe the last one, which I'm not going to talk about because spoilers. Here's the thing I haven't talked too much about yet. KOTOR 2 was incredibly rushed during production. Some reports say around 13 months, and that's kind of fucking insane for something of this scope. And it's both a benefit and a detriment. A benefit because, again, there's an opportunity to return to previous worlds and see how the world has changed with less strain on developers. And also, this game plays almost identically to the first one. What changes the gameplay that are here simply build upon something that was already great. Combat on a surface level is mostly the same, but lightsabers and force powers have been upgraded to have different forms and stances to make them more dynamic. There's no longer just a one-size-fits-all use for them, and it makes them feel much more whatever we're using for realism to describe the Star Wars universe. However, it's a huge detriment because it's noticeably more glitchy and unpolished. Things like dialogue fast forwarding and again cutscenes not triggering are an inconvenience at best and game breaking at worst. Towards the end of the game, you're required to place 4 bombs. After you place 3, 1 explodes and you have to improvise a 4th, all while chasing down a Sith Lord. I placed the 3, chased down the Sith Lord, then went back to place the 4th and found that the cutscene wouldn't trigger. I looked around and found that instead of placing them in 1, 2, 3, 4 order, you have to place them in 1, 2, 4, 3 order. The 4th location cutscene doesn't trigger if the premature cutscene has played, and you're trapped on the ship until you get everything done. It's a little, well, broken. That explanation was also broken. I know that there's restored content mods and the like, but for my first playthrough, I wanted to get to as close to the original as I could. I wasn't playing version 1.0 or anything, but the restored content mod is just that, a fan mod.
One thing I did want to say is I think people are take the assumption that what got added to the restoration mod was somehow like all of our stuff in the files, when in fact stuff that I've seen is stuff that the restoration developers actually added themselves. So I think that it's a little unfair of people sometimes to simply assume that all that content was generated by Obsidian, when in fact it was the restoration modders who actually brought that stuff to life and added their own creativity and content to it. And I'm incredibly grateful for them for doing it. I just wish we'd had the time to do it.
It's a really cool thing, these people making it, but like the despecialized Harmy editions, it's hard to appreciate them if you haven't seen what's been changed. It's noticeable that there aren't as many big wow moments in the same way as there was in KOTOR 1. A lot of the pre-rendered high-end cutscenes are reserved for transit. Moments like getting your lightsaber, which were met with great celebration in the first game, are met with simple dialogue moments in this one. While the actual building of the lightsaber feels more personal, they aren't held with the same reverence as before. I said in my KOTOR 1 video that I like the way you're eased into lightsaber combat, but since Kreia doesn't have her own lightsaber like Bastila did, you're the first one to get one, so it doesn't feel as special. That, coupled with what feels like more combat with other lightsaber wielders, makes them feel a little cheaper. I don't know, I'm very lightsaber conservative. They're best used in limited quantities. Something like this makes me more excited than something like this. And I feel like KOTOR 1 was more in line with my opinion. The late game of this one is practically bogged down by it. However, the lightsaber/force combat stuff are still some of the best parts, and so it's definitely not like a super bad thing. As a whole, while I wouldn't say I enjoyed it more than the first game, KOTOR 2 is still a really interesting and enthralling RPG experience. It's a little bumpy in some places, but it's still worth playing. However, the end is substantially more open-ended. Like I was half expecting you to zip off and get a title card that said "The End" and then a question mark faded in or something. It's a bit of a shame. I like these stories and these characters, and I wish that there was more to explore. While writing this, I started in on the prequel comics from John Jackson Miller and the Revan novel by Drew Karpyshyn. The latter ties into the Old Republic MMO apparently, and a lot of people criticize it, but like, if that's the only place for answers other than equally long and boring YouTube videos, then what's a guy gonna do? Outside media definitely doesn't scratch my KOTOR itch by any means. It doesn't satisfy in its endings either. I think that's the eternal bittersweet curse of these games. So many people long for more media in this era, a film or a TV show, but why they're so strong to me personally and why they seem to matter is because they feel like one of the first times that you, the player, can have what feels like a tangible influence on the whole Star Wars galaxy. These stories are compelling, certainly because they're well written and cinematic and have way more lore and content in them than would work in a 2-hour movie, but also because they're, your story. They feel personal to you. God, this is about to get super cheesy, I know, just bear with me. Like I said before, Star Wars is about the people who love it. Even in a time when there's been no Star Wars content, talking about it and bonding over it and just having people come up to me and say, "Hey, nice Star Wars shirt," in public is like the thing that makes the Star Wars community such a cool thing to be involved in. And I know there's that old saying about the only good Star Wars fan is a dead Star Wars fan or whatever. Oh no, wait, that's way off, sorry. It's, nobody hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans, but like, going to Celebration and bonding with coworkers and old friends and complete strangers have been some of my absolute coolest memories. I mean, this channel is rooted in the ever-present Star Wars hype, starting out just before The Force Awakens came out. And like, I know we really don't have any ownership over the actual stories of Star Wars, but these 2 KOTOR games, and I imagine the Old Republic MMO as well, are your chance to have just that. And while I definitely fell in love with this era, it would be really hard to capture that feeling and that attachment again. It's certainly not the only good part of these games, but to me, it's definitely the biggest. I don't know. Our retention stats basically say that no one will make it this far anyway, so The Last Jedi was good. Like, really fucking good. Like, I've liked Star Wars for years, almost as long as I can remember, and like, that movie is just a powerhouse of challenging, compelling, and interesting Star Wars fiction. I don't know. YouTube comments on Kotor videos are fucking swamped in people saying, this is the real Star Wars or whatever, but like, just because you like one thing doesn't mean you have to hate the other. I've bought EU books new since the buyout, and they're very much still in print. I told myself I wouldn't get into this, but like, it must be really hard to have so much Star Wars hype and fever and just love, and to sit at home like a loser on prom night being angry on the internet and thinking that everybody who likes a fucking movie was paid by Disney. Also, now that we're at the end of this trilogy, can we stop saying that we should have just used the books that take place after Return of the Jedi? Like, wouldn't that be so boring to sit down in a Star Wars movie and know exactly what's gonna happen? Or if it was post-Crucible, to expect an 8-year-old child to read 30 plus years of Star Wars canon? Like, what other option did you really think there was? I mean, I'm a huge defender of the expanded universe, more than most, and there's a lot of good there, but there's also a lot of bad in there as well. I don't know what you really expected. Also, literally anybody calling the child from The Mandalorian Baby Yoda knows that it isn't actually Baby Yoda, and you're an asshole if you spend your time correcting fucking AV Club articles or whatever. Also, if you think Disney has the time to pay off a bunch of YouTube channels to say positive things about a movie that's over 2 years old, you really need to take a minute and check not only your priorities, but also theirs as well. Also, I followed Kelly Marie Tran and Daisy Ridley on Instagram, and if you think that the hatred that they got on social media was fake or didn't happen, you are really, really, really wrong, and you should feel very bad. Kelly Marie Tran is a treasure, and frankly, you're not. You know, I'm debating cutting some of that out. It doesn't really seem like it's worth the effort. What I'm trying to get at and what I'm trying to have people understand is that everyone's Star Wars is different. Everybody loves different parts of it, but we all really enjoy the universe and how it was made. And while I may disagree with choices that Avalon made in KOTOR 2 in the same way that you disagree with choices that Rian Johnson made, we all love Star Wars. And it isn't our job to berate them on social media or gatekeep fans who have a different Star Wars than you. Listen to people when they talk about their favorite pieces of media and maybe show them yours. Maybe you'll find that you have the same type of Star Wars or you enjoy the same thing. I just wish people would just chill out a little bit. It's a movie about wars in space, and it's pretty fucking cool.